Good day. Today is Monday, 11th August 2025, and well, we are in a situation that has been described many times by various people. The classic discussion of it, as I remember, was made by Eve Smith in Naked Capitalism maybe a year ago, maybe longer. A situation where, in advance of a negotiation with the other side, in this case obviously Russia, the West spends all its time negotiating with itself. It takes an enormous amount of effort and energy as Western officials and Western leaders talk with each other to try to come up with some kind of common ground in advance of the negotiation with the other side. And by the time the common ground is agreed, it has become so detached from the actual realities of the situation, so far removed from anything that the other side might be interested in agreeing to, that the prospects of the negotiation are stillborn. Now, this process, which has also been described by various others, by George Beebe, for example, who is one of the major contributors at Responsible Statecraft, others as well. Aurelian, the British diplomat who writes by the pen name Aurelian, has just talked about it in an article that he has published on his very interesting Substack blog. Anyway, this process was in full view and in full flow over the last couple of days, ever since it became known that the presidents of Russia and the presidents of America were going to meet, and that there was going to be a summit meeting between them on Friday, the 15th of August. And the news, as I've discussed in many programs now, not many programs, but in various programs now, that the presidents of Russia and America were going to meet, provoked horror and shock in Kiev, in Europe. There was clearly an atmosphere of panic and dismay. After all, the Trump administration had itself been working very hard over the previous weeks to raise expectations in Ukraine and in Europe that the United States was on the brink of imposing massive, bone-crushing sanctions and tariffs on Russia. Trump had made various statements about ultimatums that he was going to impose on the Russians. He'd set out deadlines. He himself had talked about imposing 100% tariffs on Russian goods exported by Russia to the United States. They barely exist, by the way. And 100% tariffs on Russia's major trading partners. Anyway, there was expectations, hopes, predictions that this was coming, that Trump had finally understood that Putin was the real villain in the Ukraine war, and that he had finally sided with the mainstream views and beliefs in the West. And then suddenly, the announcement that instead of the bone-crushing sanctions, instead of the sanctions and tariff announcements, the announcement came on Friday, the day when the sanctions and the tariffs were supposed to be imposed, that the United States and Russia were indeed going to meet, that the presidents of these two countries were going to meet in Alaska. So what the London Times referred to as a scramble then took place. Firstly, Zelensky he made a video address, which he then published on his Telegram channel so that his friends in Europe could see it, in which he completely ruled out any territorial concessions by Ukraine whatsoever. He insisted that Ukraine must have what he called a just and lasting peace. In other words, at most, a unilateral ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire, a freezing of the conflicts. Ukraine must not be put in a position of making any kind of concessions at all. So that was Zelensky's video address, obviously staking out Ukraine's position, but also intended as a rallying call to Ukraine's many friends in the United States and to the various European governments, which have all been supporting Ukraine. And then, of course, Zelensky embarked upon a lengthy sequence of telephone calls, calling European leaders, trying to get them to agree to the position that he outlined. And we also got reports that there was going to be a meeting between the Americans and the Europeans and the Ukrainians in Chevening, David Lammy's, the British Foreign Minister's residence in the countryside, in the English countryside, and no less a person than Yermak, Zelensky's formidable chief of staff, was being dispatched there to talk to the Americans, to Vance and Witkoff, and Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, the hardline US senator, the inventor of the bone-crushing sanctions idea, whilst he has just given an interview which, whilst he again goes out of his way to praise Trump, talks about how he is fully behind Trump, nonetheless, he confirms that he's been in on all of the telephone calls with the Europeans, with the Ukrainians. He's been speaking to them. Clearly, the Ukrainians have reached out to him. Probably he has reached out to the Ukrainians as well. No doubt he has been speaking to the Europeans as well. He is busy formulating the position that all of these countries have been taking in that great scramble to establish the stance ahead of the Putin-Trump meeting. And as I make this video today, there are now stories circulating that there's going to be some kind of video conference in which Trump and the European leaders and the Ukrainians, Zelensky himself presumably, will all participate just before the meeting with Putin takes place in Alaska. There has been, as I discussed in several programs now, a concerted push by the Ukrainians and by the Europeans to get Zelensky himself invited to Alaska, though apparently Trump does understand that Putin is not going to be prepared to meet with Zelensky in Alaska. So there's going to be a bilateral meeting between Putin and Trump, and then the Americans, at least some people in the United States, under all of this pressure from the Europeans, from the hardliners in Washington, people like Lindsey Graham, from the Ukrainians themselves, the Americans have been under enormous pressure to extend an invitation to Zelensky himself to go. I spoke in my program yesterday about Zelensky gate-crashing the meeting in Alaska, and we could see how attempts are underway to achieve precisely that. So all of this going on, all of this busy negotiations, haggling, anxious discussions with Vance, with Witkoff, with other US officials in advance of the meeting. And finally, yesterday, we got the statement from the Europeans, which I'm not going to waste my time reading out on this program. But anyway, the statement by the Europeans setting out Europe's position, the position of the Ukrainians as well. There must be no territorial concessions agreed by the Americans with Putin on Friday. The way forward is an unconditional ceasefire, a freezing of the conflict, and then negotiations can begin. but the negotiations must respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. In other words, its 1991 borders, which of course include Crimea, its sovereignty, its independence, and in addition, Ukraine must be provided with cast iron security guarantees, some kind of military agreement to protect, to defend Ukraine, which could, of course, include, and in fact is intended, no doubt, to mean eventual entry into NATO. And on top of that, and beyond all of that, there must be, of course, no restrictions on the size of Ukraine's armed forces or on its ability to obtain weapons from the Western powers to build up those armed forces. Now, that has been the European position and the Ukrainian position ever since Donald Trump and his officials forced the Ukrainians to accept a ceasefire. Now, again, it's important to stress that until March of this year, Ukraine had resisted all demands for a ceasefire. It said that it would only agree to a ceasefire or would only consider agreeing to a ceasefire if it received guarantees, military and security guarantees, cast iron guarantees from the United States and from the Europeans, from NATO. And of course, it was never difficult to understand what the Ukrainians were talking about. They wanted those guarantees because if there was a ceasefire combined with those guarantees, the Ukrainians, as night follows day, would ensure that the ceasefire collapsed. They would say that the Russians had violated the ceasefire. They would then call on the United States and on the Europeans to enforce the ceasefire in accordance with those guarantees. And the objective that the Ukrainians have always had throughout the war, basically, going all the way back to 2022, but which has become particularly important for the Ukrainians since the failure of their own offensive in the summer of 2023. The objective to get the United States in particular directly involved in the conflict with Russia. Well, that finally, if this sequence of events had played out the way the Ukrainians wanted, if it had played out that way, that objective would have been achieved. Anyway, the Americans, Donald Trump, said a categorical no. He was not prepared to provide the Ukrainians with a guarantee, that kind of a guarantee. And then he sent his officials to meet with the Ukrainians in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, making sure that Zelensky himself was kept away. I discussed that all at the time. And the Ukrainians were strong-armed into agreeing to an unconditional ceasefire without guarantees, by having intelligence assistance denied them and by having military aid from the United States blocked. And the Ukrainians caved in. They agreed to the unconditional ceasefire, or at least gave the impression that they had. And that's been the American, the European, the Ukrainian position ever since. Though in reality, and I think this is a key thing to understand, the Ukrainians have not ever really conceded, because they have been working, and their European friends have been working to get guarantees brought back in through the back door. So guarantees provided by the United States. So we had, over the course of the spring, the Macron-Starmer proposal to send a peacekeeping force to Ukraine to enforce the ceasefire. But of course, it was made very clear that this European peacekeeping force would have to have an American backstop. In other words, an American guarantee. So again, if the ceasefire broke down and the European troops in Ukraine found themselves in the middle of the conflict, which of course they were bound to find themselves in if the ceasefire did indeed break down, then the Americans would have to come in to defend them. And of course, that would bring about the direct involvement of the United States in the Ukraine conflict in exactly the way that Zelensky and the Ukrainians have been scheming to achieve ever since the conflict began. And then, of course, the Americans said no, they would not agree to provide that backstop. But now, following a further fraught sequence of meetings that took place in March and April, and thereafter meetings in London and Rome, the Ukrainians, the Europeans again said, right, first there needs to be a ceasefire and negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians, a freezing of the conflict. And whilst that freeze of the conflict is underway, again, of course, the Ukrainians would receive their security guarantees, which of course would also involve the United States. So we could say that in practice, the idea of security guarantees always and constantly remains in play. And this announcement, this latest statement that the Europeans circulated, well, surprise, surprise, security guarantees, the provision to Ukraine of security guarantees after the unconditional ceasefire is agreed. Well, it's there again, and they go to great lengths to explain why these security guarantees are important, given the very real risk that Russia might supposedly attack Ukraine again if there is a ceasefire. So we could see that this is the basic default NATO position. I stress NATO position because all of the major European states are signed up to it. The permanent government in the United States is signed up to it too. The NATO and EU bureaucracies obviously are signed up to it. The only people who push back on it from time to time in the West, I'm talking now about decision makers, are the President of the United States himself, Donald Trump. He does not want to give Ukraine security guarantees because he understands perfectly well that this would be a trap for the United States, and a small group of officials gathered around him. Anyway, I've explained all of this. I've said this all, and I've discussed this many times in many, many programs. But we see how with this statement that the Europeans have now published, we are back again at that very same position. The European plan, the NATO plan, the plan of the various European officials, of the Ukrainians themselves. I say plan, maybe they haven't really discussed it all with each other. Maybe it's going too far to say that they've schemed it, though people do scheme things. At least maybe that's true of the European capitals. In Kiev, I have no doubt that they have schemed it. But anyway, the plan, again, is to freeze the conflict, get the Americans involved, get the Americans to provide a guarantee to the Ukrainians. There might, in that case, be a North Korea type, a Korea type scenario, a situation in which the Russians control Donbass and other stretches of eastern Ukraine, but without any kind of international recognition. And the rest of Ukraine has a military guarantee from the United States. There are European troops stationed, NATO troops stationed in western Ukraine. That will be one outcome of this. The other outcome, I think a much more likely outcome, given the nature of the government in Kiev, is that this would be an unstable ceasefire situation. The Ukrainians, having finally obtained the guarantee that they've always been working towards, would say that the ceasefire has broken down. They would arrange a breakdown of the ceasefire. The fighting would resume. The Europeans would obviously be involved. The peacekeeping force would obviously be involved. And the Ukrainians and the Europeans would then call on the United States to involve itself directly in the war. So this is the NATO position. Lindsey Graham, in that interview that I discussed, basically touched on it himself. He didn't go into all the details. He did accept that there might be land swaps and these sort of things. But he made it very clear, for example, that the United States and the Europeans would never recognize formally any territory that the Russians control in eastern Ukraine as actually Russian. There would simply be acceptance of the reality, as he puts it, but not official recognition of it, which makes the situation inherently unstable, given, as I said already, that the nature of the government, the political system in Kiev. So we are back, if the Europeans, if NATO, if the Ukrainians, if the hardliners in Washington, back exactly where we started. They've made no concessions at all. They continue to insist that this proposal, which of course the Russians have continuously rejected, the Russians have rejected it time and again, that this demand which they make is the only one that they're prepared to entertain and the only one that they're prepared to accept. They want a freeze of the conflict with security guarantees for Ukraine, NATO forces in whatever number in Western Ukraine, and the United States committed to defending Ukraine, eventually by bringing Ukraine into NATO. This remains the plan. Now, why they imagine that the Russians would ever accept this? Well, I spoke, perhaps rather emotionally, in my program that it shows a fundamental lack of vision or understanding of the conflict that the Russians ever would accept this. That, in fact, making proposals to Putin on Friday of this kind simply guarantees that the war will continue and simply guarantees that Ukraine will then eventually lose. But, as Eve Smith in that article correctly said, in this kind of situation where the West negotiates with itself, inevitably, invariably, it is those who take the most hardline positions who will win out, because this kind of process is almost structured to achieve that outcome. And of course, there is again the presumption that even allowing the Russians to retain control over the territory that they currently occupy in eastern Ukraine, that is an enormous concession to the Russians, and the Russians should accept it. And then, of course, when the Russians don't accept it, then inevitably they're going to say on Friday that this isn't remotely acceptable to them. There will be the bafflement, there will be the bewilderment, there will be the anger, and the Americans, the Europeans will go away and will say again that the Russians are being intransigent and hardline and don't see what is good for them. Anyway, this is the situation. This is what has played out over the weekend. Now, it needs to be said at once that there are nonetheless nuances here, because I did say previously that there were some people in Washington who do seem to understand that the Russians will not accept this, that the situation is not going to play out this way, that this will eventually prolong the war, and that the United States risks becoming very deeply involved. The most interesting comments were made by the Vice President, the US Vice President, by J.D. Vance. He said that the outcome of the negotiations, if they're successful, will be such that neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians will be completely satisfied with them. He spoke about the current front lines being the starting point of any discussions. I found his words here, by the way, interesting, but I'm not going to analyse this or discuss this further. The most important point he made, however, is that the United States should not be further involved. It should not continue to provide further funding for Ukraine. If the Europeans want to buy weapons for Ukraine from the United States, that is up to them. The key point is that the United States should no longer be involved in this conflict. Certainly, though, as I said, he didn't actually say this, certainly the United States should not be giving guarantees to Ukraine or anything like that. So there is that view in Washington. The president himself sometimes gives the impression of leaning towards it. He refused, for example, back in the spring to give any commitments to provide the British and the French with the backstop, the guarantee for their military forces that they were asking for. He's always resisted giving any kind of formal guarantee to Ukraine. He has ruled out Ukraine joining NATO, at least whilst he is president. So you can see that he sometimes, or at least with part of his mind, he leans strongly towards these people in Washington who are obviously deeply skeptical of this whole project. But of course, he is in a difficult position. He's got the Senate, which clearly does want to continue to support Ukraine. Lindsey Graham, whilst proclaiming his loyalty to Donald Trump, whilst speaking with lavish praise about the Vice President, J.D. Vance, was over the course of that same interview, as far as I could see, laying down markers, which drawing red lines for what he would agree that they could concede in any talks with the Russians. So to say that this is because that the president himself might sometimes lean towards these ideas doesn't mean that these ideas, this skepticism, will prevail against what the Europeans, the neocons, the permanent state in Washington, the Ukrainians insist should be the only outcome in the conflict. A freeze and ultimately security guarantees for Ukraine. Well, there are some people, a very few people, who are beginning to understand, who are starting to see that things are not quite as simple as they themselves previously believed. Now, there's been another article in the Financial Times by Gideon Rackman, who is, I believe, its main political editor, though I might be wrong there. And Gideon Rackman has been a fervid supporter of Ukraine. He has, however, in this article, I'm not going to read it, it's quite long, Trump, Putin, and the future of Ukraine. And the subtitle is, "There is a danger for both Kiev and Europe that they lose sight of a strategic vision of where they want to get to." Anyway, he is admitting for the first, he is admitting that Ukraine is, as he put it, slowly losing the war. He accepts, therefore, that Ukraine is going to have to surrender territory. But again, he basically wants this to be a mechanism towards achieving a freeze. So his position is actually very close to Zelensky's, not ultimately very different from Zelensky's. But what he is saying to Zelensky is, look, you can get the freeze of the conflict. You can ultimately perhaps get those security guarantees, which is what you want. But given that you are losing and the Russians are winning, you might have to surrender territory. Not just freeze the conflict on the existing front lines, but actually surrender territory that you actually physically control at this particular time. And he says that this is something that the Ukrainians might need to entertain doing in order to get to that point where they freeze the conflict and get those security guarantees, which is what they're angling for. Refusing to give up territory puts the whole thing in jeopardy. It will mean that the Russians will simply go on fighting the war and winning it. And it might mean that the Americans themselves finally sour of their support for Ukraine. They will say that the Ukrainians are being unrealistic and intransigent and might walk away. Now, the article shows some insight on the part of Gideon Rackman. But notice that he ultimately also is conceding nothing of substance. He still wants a freeze of the conflict, and he still wants security guarantees for Ukraine, and ultimately, no doubt, Ukraine joining NATO, and of course, no changes in Ukraine's political arrangements, its ability to build up its armed forces to do all of those things. So anyway, this is where we are at the moment in the negotiations. Now, there is some reports, there's still massive confusion, I should say. This is a detail that I'm going to touch on about what Putin supposedly offered Witkoff. There's still uncertainty about whether Putin said that the Russians would agree to a ceasefire if the Ukrainians pulled out of Donbass, and that the Ukrainians didn't need to pull out of Zaporozhye and Kherson region. An article in Unheard, which quotes a US official, perhaps Witkoff himself, says that what the Russians seem to be thinking about is a situation where there is a ceasefire, the Ukrainians pull out of Donbass, and then there is a land swap whereby the Ukrainians receive back territory in Kharkiv and Sumy and Dnipropetrovsk regions in return for Russia being handed over the remainder of Zaporozhye and Kherson region as well. Zaporozhye city and the city of Kherson. So it may be that something like that was discussed between Putin and Witkoff last Wednesday. On balance, I still think that more likely the Bild Zeitung article is closer to the truth. That Putin said to Witkoff that the Ukrainians should withdraw from all of the 4 regions, which is what Putin said on the 14th of June 2024, and what he's consistently said publicly ever since. And either Witkoff misunderstood what Putin was saying, or perhaps Witkoff and the Americans are trying to spin Putin's words to see whether they can get the ceasefire, but with a Ukrainian pullout limited to just Donbass. Anyway, we shall see. But my point is that the Europeans, the Ukrainians, don't seem to be able to concede fundamentally anything. Even Gideon Rackman, who is perhaps represents the more realistic view amongst them, still speaks about security guarantees and freezes of the conflict. He just accepts that the Ukrainians might have to give up a little more territory. There is no sign that they are prepared to move forward and agree to anything more substantial in order to end the conflict in Ukraine. Now, here, the difference with the Trump-Vance, well, what I interpret to be the realist position of the US, the Trump-Vance people, is that they would have the conflict end, the fighting end, but with no guarantees provided to Ukraine. The Europeans want guarantees to be provided to Ukraine. Trump and Vance are saying no. Vance says that the Americans are tired of Ukraine. They don't want to continue the commitment any further. And that, I think, is the most important thing that Vance has said. And as I said, I think it reflects a certain view within the US government. Anyway, the Russians are obviously following and watching all of this. They are saying very little at the moment. One shouldn't expect them to. But they are giving no hint at the moment that they're prepared to concede on anything. I don't see why the Russians would be interested in making concessions at the present time. I've been reading all sorts of really very strange commentaries taking place in the West about the fact that the Russian position isn't that strong. Obviously, much of this is based on misrepresentations or misunderstandings of the military situation. I will come to that shortly. There is some really remarkable claims about the state of the Russian economy. I read an article in the Daily Telegraph which claimed absurdly that the Russian economy is in free fall. There is no evidence of this that I have been able to find from any publication that I know of and take seriously discussing the economy in Russia. On the contrary, since the central bank cut interest rates, it seems that lending has resumed in Russia. The latest figures for the performance of the economy in the first half of this year showed continued growth, around 1.6%. It looks as if Russia came close to contraction in June and July, but overall managed to avoid it. More likely than not, we will see zero growth in annualized terms in the last quarter of 2025. This is not because there will be no growth at all. Probably the economy will start to pick up from where it was, from where it is at the moment over the course of the next few months. But there was very, very rapid growth, over rapid growth in the Russian economy in the last quarter of 2024. And because of that, statistically, it's likely that if growth over the whole year is more subdued this year than it was last year, which it will be, that means that statistically it will look as if growth is the economy is flat in the last quarter as compared to the last quarter of 2024. Most estimates that I've seen expect growth in Russia to be around 1.5, 1.6% on an annualized rate level over the course of this whole year. Well, that's not a boom, but as I've said already, the economy needed to be cooled down to bring down inflation, and that does seem to be happening rather well. We are now looking at deflation in the economy, in the Russian economy at the moment. Inflation is actually falling fast, much faster than the central bank apparently expected. It looks like inflation overall is going to be lower than the central bank expected at the end of this year. The central bank is talking about interest rates at 12 to 13% by the end of this year, the start of next year. Where people see evidence of a free fall, I am completely unable to see myself. Even if there was a small contraction in June, July of this year, Germany has been experiencing contractions in its economy now for 3 years. It's clearly in deep recession. I've not seen anybody in the Western commentariat, so far at least, speak of the German economy in free fall. Maybe they should, but it certainly doesn't seem to me to apply to Russia. So there is no free fall in the Russian economy. The bone-crushing sanctions that we've been hearing about would only have any chance of success if Russia's trading partners, India, China, enforce them. But they've said they won't. I've discussed this in program after program. The military situation is going very strongly in Russia's favor. The Russians are not winning the war slowly. They're winning the war quickly, and as I will discuss in a moment. So where exactly is it that people see the situation currently where Putin feels under pressure to make concessions at this summit meeting, which is going to take place between Trump and Putin himself on Friday? I can't see it myself. He's already said that he doesn't intend to meet Zelensky, despite the various attempts to bounce him into a meeting. It seems to me that he has no reason to make significant concessions. And I haven't seen a single commentary or comment anywhere from official government sources in Moscow, from the media there, which suggests that he's in any mood to make concessions at all, or that the Russians intend to make big concessions at all. Now, of course, it could be that for some reason unknown to me, Putin does decide that he's going to agree to all of Donald Trump's demands or a freeze of the conflict and all of that. I can't imagine why he would do that, but then, of course, I can't predict everything that will happen, and it may be that some great surprise awaits us on Friday. But for the moment, at least, I see no grounds at all to think so. And until it happens, I am not going to expect it. Just saying. So anyway, there we go. Now, we will get the summit meeting on Friday. It's important to say that if it takes place, and I expect that it will take place, already it's a win for Putin. He's established a dialogue with Trump. He's managed to get a visit to the United States, to Alaska. He's no longer, as far as the West is concerned, a pariah. There's been endless attempts to boycott him, to avoid having any contacts with him in the long years of the Biden administration. I remember Russian officials saying, Polyansky, the Russian deputy ambassador at the UN, saying that it had got to a ridiculous situation where at international gatherings which the Russians attended, the Western officials would avoid having any contact with the Russians, as if the Russians were bearers of some terrible infectious disease. Well, all of that, it seems to me, is now in effect over. If Putin comes to Alaska, the Americans and the Russians are talking. If the Europeans continue to refuse to talk to the Russians, well, they're simply marginalizing themselves. They are leaving themselves out of the discussion. As I have repeatedly pointed out, as the Russians have repeatedly pointed out, if the Europeans want to make their case to Moscow, they can talk to Moscow. Refusing to do so simply means that only the Americans are talking to the Russians. The Europeans, obviously, in that case, are not, and they are left with no option but to talk to the Americans in the hope of influencing the Americans and getting the Americans to take the stance that they want the Americans to take in the discussions with the Russians. An undignified and pointless position, and one which the Europeans have maneuvered themselves into. Anyway, let's now talk about the military situation. As I said, much fire and thunder and talk and negotiations. As I said, it's extraordinary to see how we see these negotiations that the West engages in with itself, and they always end up in the same position as before. No real movement towards the other side, with the result being that the prospects, as I said, for the negotiations on Friday are stillborn. Now, what is going to happen on the military front lines if there is not going to be a deal, a negotiated settlement agreed between the Americans and the Russians to bring the Russian offensive to an end? Well, the last couple of hours continue to be very dramatic on the Ukrainian front lines, and it's becoming difficult to keep up with the speed of events on the front lines. And again, I wonder to what extent people in the West are aware of how fast events are now moving. There are reports that Russian reconnaissance units have moved as far north as the village of Zaloty Kolodyas, which is located to the northeast of Dobropilia. Bear in mind that Redovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, is claiming that the Russians have crossed the road between Belitska and Rodinska, the road which leads into Pokrovsk from the north, and have reached the outskirts of the village of Shevchenko to the southeast of Dobropilia. The point is that Zoloty Kolodias is located about 3 kilometers south of yet another road that leads from Dobropilia to Kramatorsk. Now, various commentators are claiming that this particular road is enormously important for supplies and all of that, and maybe that's true. I'm not saying that it is not. The point is that the Russian advance northwards seems to be not only unstoppable, but largely unresisted. It's as if the Ukrainians have no troops capable of holding the Russians back on this territory. Now, I said that the reports that the Russians have reached the outskirts of Zoloty Kolodias is coming from Russian sources, and that is true. But Deep State, the Ukrainian mapping project, has now published an update which shows much more territory, even territory, as far as I could see, to the north of Zoloty Kolodias, territory actually that, as far as I can see, includes this road from Dobropilia to Kramatorsk, being in the grey zone, implying that there are Russian reconnaissance groups, special forces groups, operating all across this territory. Maybe the Russians don't control Zoloty Kolodias, but their reconnaissance groups, their special forces units are apparently operating even to the north of this particular settlement. Now, to stress, I don't know that this is actually the case. And I know that there are some who think that these claims from Redovka, from Deep State, from others, actually overstate the reality. That the Russians have indeed cut the road leading into Pokrovsk in the north between Belitska and Rodinska, but it's not correct that they have pushed beyond the road any great distance and that they have reached Shevchenko. That it is true that the Russians are continuing to advance northwards, but that it's not yet the case that they have actually reached Zoloty Kolodias, not to mention gone beyond that village, at least their reconnaissance units having gone beyond that village. To repeat again what I've said many times, I am not there. I don't know factually what is taking place. The point is that these reports exist, and they are coming both from Russian and Ukrainian sources, and they speak of a massive crisis for the Ukrainians north of Pokrovsk. And not just a crisis for the Ukrainians north of Mercouris, but of a potential collapse of Ukrainian positions north of Mercouris as well. In some ways, this situation is starting to remind me of what happened in the late summer and autumn of 2024. The Russians had advanced all the way to Pokrovsk. There were lots of expectations that I shared at that time, that the Russians, having reached Pokrovsk, would then take steps to storm Pokrovsk. But instead, the Russians turned south and they captured a string of important towns to the south of Pokrovsk, Novogrodivka, Selidovo, Kurachovo, Ugledar, ultimately Velikaya Novosilka as well. And of course, capturing all of these positions massively strengthened the Russian position overall, but they didn't seek to capture Pokrovsk. So the Ukrainians focused on defending Pokrovsk, lost sight of the collapse of all of their positions south of Pokrovsk. And the Russians perhaps are doing the same thing again. The Ukrainians focused on defending their positions in Pokrovsk. I've no doubt, by the way, that the Russians do this time intend to defend Pokrovsk, have overlooked the fact that the Russians are also pushing northward and that they are now apparently intent on capturing positions to the north of Pokrovsk in exactly the same way. There are also reports that the Russians are busy attacking other positions. There's apparently attacks on a place called Rusin Yar, which I'm not entirely sure where it is, but it's in this sort of general area to the north of Pokrovsk, that they're attacking Poltavka, another village to the northeast of Pokrovsk, that all of these places are rapidly falling to the Russians, that the entire Ukrainian position north of Pokrovsk is unraveling, even as the Ukrainians focus on defending Pokrovsk. As for Pokrovsk itself, there are some reports of further Russian advances within Pokrovsk. In fact, there's confirmation now that the Russians do indeed control the village of Leontovichy, which is located to the southwest of Pokrovsk. It's basically an outer suburb of Pokrovsk. The fighting in Pokrovsk continues. My sense is that there is a certain amount of street fighting taking place now in the center of Pokrovsk. The Russians have not crossed the railway line, which bisects Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is a city which is bisected by a big railway line, very wide. There are many tracks, and this is, of course, a natural fortified barrier. I think that the Russians have reached the railway line, but I don't think they've crossed it. And as I've discussed in previous programs, I think that their major focus at the moment is on keeping the Ukrainian troops in the Shakhtarsky micro-district in southeast Pokrovsk bottled up there. And I don't think that the Russians are currently attacking them there. But anyway, sooner or later, Pokrovsk is going to fall. I've seen suggestions that this could happen in about 2 weeks' time. Again, I'm not going to make predictions. But already, because of these enormous Russian advances north of Pokrovsk, the entire understanding of how the battle from this point on could develop is starting to change. So until recently, the focus was on the Russians advancing from Pokrovsk westwards towards the Dnieper, towards the cities of Dnipro and ultimately Zaporozhye. Now the talk is increasingly of the Russians moving northwards, of encircling the Ukrainians in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, especially after Konstantinovka falls, and Konstantinovka is now largely encircled itself. We'll come to that in a moment. And then once Slavyansk and Kramatorsk also fall once the Russians are in control of Donbass. It's been suggested now that the Russians might actually continue to strike north. They might strike north towards Kharkiv, the city of Kharkiv. The Institute for the Study of War has now actually floated this possibility, with the Russians now largely in control of Volchansk, having established significant positions in Kharkiv region, and soon likely to capture more positions, including the town of Kupiansk. It's been suggested that if the Russians advance north from Donbass through basically open, undefended country towards Kharkiv, the city will become undefendable and will be surrounded and will eventually fall. And that, of course, would mean the loss for Ukraine of its second biggest city. And if Kharkiv were to fall in that way, I have to say, it seems to me that all of eastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, would rapidly fall also. So there are now discussions and debates about whether the Russians plan in the end to strike north or to strike west. We are well ahead of current events at the moment, just saying. But the fact that these debates are even happening, the fact that they're even being floated by the Institute for the Study of War, does give a sense of how critical the military situation for the Ukrainians in Donbass is now becoming. Now, let's look further. Let's also discuss what is now happening in Konstantinovka. It looks as if the Russians are about to capture all of the territory south of the Klibanbek reservoir, south of Konstantinovka. They've already established strong positions to the east of Konstantinovka. They're very close to Konstantinovka, along its eastern side. They now control the high ground, which is Chasov Yar, and they also control positions to the west of Konstantinovka as well. If the Russians continue their advance northward, then all the supply lines to Konstantinovka start to become critically endangered. Apparently, Russian drones are now operating across all of the major supply lines in this area of Donbass. And very interestingly, it seems as if an adaptation of the Geran drone has now come into service. There's apparently film showing it, whereby this drone, this Geran drone, actually starts dropping mines on main roads. In other words, it starts to remotely mine the big supply roads. Now, these, of course, these mines, which would be dropped from the air, would be visible on the asphalt roads. But, of course, mines have to be cleared. That takes time. It slows movement. The mere fact of mining roads slows movement, and it creates dangers for the Ukrainian supply convoys to the extent that they're able to function at all. It seems to me that gradually, step by step, the Russians, with their drones and their bombs and their Geran drones and all of the rest, are gradually strangling, closing down all the main supply roads in Donbass, at least the remaining supply roads in Donbass, in advance of the final battle for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and all of those places. And if we're talking about Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, there's been lots of news from the Liman, Seversk area. There's been more reports of Russian advances in the village of Serebyanka and the Serebyanka forest. The Russians seem to be pushing southwards ever closer to the city of Liman, the town of Liman from the north. It's increasingly looking like a Russian assault on Liman is only a few weeks away, and a Russian assault on Siversk perhaps only a few days away. And of course, if that happens, then the position of the Ukrainians in Slavyansk is going to become very difficult. And I understand that Liman is on high ground relative to Slavyansk in much the same way that Chasiv Yar also is high ground in relation to Konstantinovka and, by the way, Kramatorsk. The fact that we are coming close to a final battle for these towns in Donbass, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, it has perhaps been provided by reports from a Russian Telegram channel, which is known to be strongly connected to the Russian military, which is advising civilians in Kramatorsk, the biggest of these three towns, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka. It's advising people in Kramatorsk to leave because street fighting, it's advising people in Konstantinovka to leave because street fighting in Konstantinovka is about to begin. So we could see the operational crisis for the Ukrainians that is starting to develop in Donbass. If the Ukrainians do not withdraw from Donbass, they will lose Donbass anyway, and it might not take as long as people assume. And if the Ukrainians lose Donbass, then I don't believe that any severe Surovikin type line beyond Donbass will hold for any time at all. And maybe Kharkiv will fall, maybe the Russians will battle through to the east bank of the Dnieper in central Ukraine, but sometime, maybe at the end of this year, maybe at some point next year, the situation in the war will have become critical for Ukraine, not critical in terms of the situation on the battlefronts, but critical in terms of the military position, the survival of the state itself, which of course Ukraine's intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, is now saying is in crisis. Now, since I mentioned Budanov, here I ought to say that the Russian intelligence agency, counterintelligence agency, the FSB, is now claiming that Budanov's and the SBU's, in other words, Ukrainian intelligence networks in Russia, are close to collapse. In 2024 alone, Russian FSB units thwarted 110 terrorist attacks, eliminated 45 terrorist cells, and detained over 1,000 individuals involved in terrorism. When the Russians here talk about terrorism, they mean Ukrainian intelligence activity, just saying, on Russian territory. Of course, most terrorist attacks in Russia are thwarted before they are carried out. The Ukrainian Special Services Agent Network is in crisis. A lack of trained agents and reduced financial aid from Western partners have impacted the Ukrainian security services activities in Russia. And I suspect that this is correct. All of those actions that the Ukrainians have taken, which have attracted so much attention, the assassinations of Russian officials, the attacks on the strategic bomber bases, all of these, whilst they might gain headlines and embarrass the Russians, what they are also doing is compromising Ukraine's various networks, intelligence networks in Russia itself. And according to the FSB, the passage that I read out comes from the official Russian news agency TASS. According to the FSB, Ukraine's intelligence networks in Russia are in crisis, that they are close to collapse, even as I discussed a short time ago, Russian networks in Ukraine are becoming denser and stronger, with the Ukrainians less and less able to counter them. So in the intelligence war, the Russians are also gaining their advantage. Now, as to why we're seeing the crisis on the battlefronts, well, there is an explanation for all of this, and it's come from Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe. This is an article that has been passed on to me by the British historian Jeff Roberts, for which I'm grateful. And the article begins with desertions, low recruitment, Ukraine's infantry crisis deepens. And the article is published on the 10th of August. And it says that the Ukrainian army is now in a critical situation as Russia presses its offensive. Ukraine faces a crisis experts say is as critical as its shortages of ammunition and weapons, a dwindling supply of infantry. Drivers, artillerymen and cooks are holding the line, says Bogdan Krotevich, an officer formerly with the Azov Brigade headquarters. A maximum of 12 fighters hold sections 5 to 10 kilometers wide. The lack of manpower is allowing Russia to employ what Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky, recently called total infiltration tactics. Small infantry groups make it through Ukrainian lines, including into Pakrovsk, the key city in the Donetsk region that is likely the main target of Russia's current offensive. Well, that is why the Russians are able to advance northwards as well. Why perhaps they've been able to reach, as we've been told, places so far to the north like Zoloty, Kolodiaz. There are just no Ukrainian infantry to hold back the Russians there. And then we are told that one of the brigades responsible for defending the area have run out of infantry. And this is according to Deep State. And we are also told about the changes in the overall balance. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting sections of this entire article. Early in the war, the balance was radically different. In the lead up to the full-scale invasion in 2022, Russia's army had about 1 million troops, with some 150 to 190,000 concentrated along Ukraine's borders with Russia and Belarus. At the time, Ukraine's military had some 260,000 men in active service, but the country mobilized up to 700,000 men by midsummer, handing it a manpower advantage over the invading Russian forces, who by then had been expelled from the Kiev region. Russia was forced to conduct a partial mobilization of about 300,000 reservists to stabilize the front line after yielding thousands of square kilometers of territory in eastern Ukraine. Now, this has never been admitted, as far as I'm aware, in any Western military publication up to now. This article tells us that in the summer of 2022, the Ukrainians outnumbered the Russians. In fact, they didn't just outnumber the Russians, they massively outnumbered the Russians. The Russians started the war with 150 to 190,000 men concentrated on Ukraine's borders. The Ukrainians had 260,000 men in active service, already more than the Russians had. And the Ukrainians added to those 260,000 a further 700,000 men by midsummer 2022. So, if you do the maths, that's close to 1 million men in active service by midsummer 2022. Now, I remember Zelensky talking about Ukraine having a 1 million man army at the time. I didn't believe it then. I now realize that he was right. And he did have 1 million men in arms, many of them with training from the West, many of them experienced soldiers who'd fought in the war, in the previous iterations of the war, in the 2014 and 2015 fighting. The Ukrainians had a lopsided advantage over the Russians in the summer and autumn of 2022. That was why the Russians pulled out of Kharkiv region, and that was why the Russians pulled out of Kherson region west of the Dnieper River. The Russians called up 300,000 men to stabilize the front lines. They did stabilize the front lines. They were probably still outnumbered by the Ukrainians, however, throughout 2023. But the men that they called up, the losses the Ukrainians had already experienced, meant that the Russian lines were able to hold, and Ukraine's famous summer offensive of 2023 was defeated. However, since then, the balance has moved further and further in Russia's favor. The Russians, again, according to this article in Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, have been growing the size of their force. They've been recruiting 30,000 men a month. The Ukrainians have never managed to make up losses. The result is that their army has shrunk, and this is what Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty says is now the military balance. In 2025, according to the military balance, this is a publication, by the way, I believe in a British military publication, an annual assessment of military capabilities worldwide, Russia's numbers of active duty personnel have reached over 1.13 million, while with Syrsky claiming 640,000 of them on Ukrainian territory, a figure echoed by President Putin. While Ukraine's total strength is officially over 1 million, the Warsaw-based Center for Eastern Studies says not more than 300,000 of them are deployed on the front lines. And we're then told that Ukraine needs at least 300,000 extra soldiers to replenish its brigades, some of which are only at 30% strength. And last year it managed 200,000, a number that has proved massively insufficient. And today the situation is actually worse. So, from a position where in 2022, 2023, the Ukrainians had a manpower advantage, in late 2022, a lopsided manpower advantage in their favor. We are now moving towards a situation where, on the contrary, it is the Russians who have a manpower advantage, and soon a lopsided manpower advantage in their favor. And that is why they're gaining ground. And of course, it's not just a manpower advantage, it's an advantage in equipment and drones and aircraft and fab bombs and all of those things. People who still talk about this war dragging on for years are not looking at the realities on the front lines. Even the Institute for the Study of War now acknowledges that if Donbass is lost, this is a crisis for Ukraine, a crisis that will, in effect, collapse Ukrainian positions east of the Dnieper. And even Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, now acknowledges that from a position of numerical superiority in 2022. By the way, if you'd been following the Western media in 2022, they never acknowledged that Ukraine had numerical superiority over the Russians. On the contrary, it was always projected as if it was the Russians who always had numerical superiority, and that the Ukrainians were achieving their victories because of their superior quality. Just saying. But anyway, from a position in 2022, when it was the Ukrainians who outnumbered the Russians and far outnumbered the Russians, we are also heading into a position in 2025, 2026, when it is the Russians who are going to far outnumber the Ukrainians. So this explains the situation on the front lines, but just go a little bit forward. Put aside the speculations about whether the Russians are going to strike north towards Kharkiv or strike west towards Dnipro and the river, the Dnieper. Just ask yourself what will happen when the balance on the battlefields, the numerical balance in men, machines, ammunition, training as well, by the way, all of that tilts even further in Russia's favor over the next few months. And the Ukrainians have lost their great fortified barrier in Donbass. They no longer have the barrier of the fortified towns Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk. Donbass has fallen. It is open country. What happens then? Is this not a position of potential collapse? Well, maybe something can be plucked out of the hat to turn the situation round. I don't know what it is. But maybe that is it actually, the situation that we are facing. A Ukrainian collapse, to repeat again, if it starts to happen, is likely to start happening quickly and suddenly. That is the nature of this sort of war. It's far from clear to me that anybody in the West is prepared for this. But one man surely knows it, and that is the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. He knows that his allies are standing by him. He knows that his economy has got through this period of cooling, that inflation is indeed coming down. As I said, it's probably the underlying annualized rate is probably around 4 to 5% at the moment, probably not much more of that. We're probably going to see a recovery in growth next year. He knows that the American attempt to cut off Russia's trade links with its various trade partners is going to fail. And he, of course, gets the reports from the front lines. He knows the state of his army. He knows an awful lot about the state of the Ukrainian army. He knows that Ukraine's intelligence network has collapsed. He knows that the Russian intelligence network in Ukraine is in a better position than it has ever been. He also knows that when he has previously made deals with the Western powers, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, they went back on those deals. They deceived him. He's complained about this. Is this all this knowledge, is it going to put him in the frame of mind when he's going to come to Alaska in a mood to make concessions? Well, I'm not going to say that Trump is going to slam the door in Donald Trump's face. I think that Trump will want to maintain a dialogue with Trump. He might offer a few concessions around the edges, just saying. I don't exclude it, but I don't think he's going to give away anything important. And the entire talk from Russia at the moment is that they want an end to the war, not a freeze. And I can't believe that Putin is going to retreat from that position. Now, to what extent Donald Trump knows all of these things that I've just been talking about, that I simply don't know. But my own feeling is that if he doesn't know it yet, then those around him who do, and I believe there are such people, should make a point of educating him and should explain to him that, in fact, if we're talking about Ukraine, then really neither he nor Ukraine have a huge number of cards to play in Alaska, that far more substantive concessions than those that have been discussed by Gideon Rackman in the Financial Times are going to have to be made if a collapse of Ukraine and a Saigon moment is going to be avoided, and that the Europeans and the Ukrainians might not get this, but ultimately it is the United States that has to make the choice. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.